So for our update, we are like at April, around April, we'll have the Chinese delegation come here
Yeah.
for through our program to cooperate with VC and cooperate with a startup here.
Cool.
That's our plan.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm. So
All the best.
so we invited you to be a guest speaker when you are available.
Will be a pleasure.
Okay, wonderful. Okay,
So we can start.
okay, we can start.
Yes.
So we'll just do a normal chat and
course.
whatever. So can you please introduce yourself and your firm, Fatima?
So actually, am I supposed to tell my name first, or that's already covered somewhere? I just introduce myself.
You could introduce yourself and your firm.
Right. Okay. Okay. So let me start with my firm first. Artiman Ventures is an early stage technology investment firm. We have about 1.2 billion under management total. We are in our fourth fund. And our investment thesis is we come in very early in a company. We focus on companies that disrupt very large spaces. So hence the word white space, areas which haven't had too much innovation in a while. And of course, by definition, these should be large markets. And if you look at our portfolio, they happen to be very technology heavy, very science heavy. There's a lot of intellectual property. And probably the other attribute I can mention is that most of our companies, we tend to stay until very late. So we come in very early and we tend to stay until very late. So as a result, we reserve enough ammunition, if you will, for future rounds.
Right.
And that means we end up making very few investments. So it's a very concentrated portfolio, and it's a very technology heavy, intellectual property heavy, and large market heavy portfolio. Now, a couple of ways to go further. I can give a few examples. For example, if you look at the construction industry, it's an industry which is large,
Okay.
so $8 trillion globally, has not had really any innovation in the last 50 years. It has a room for disruption, which means it's a very fragmented space, a lot of inefficiencies. So if somebody can disrupt that space, there's a lot of value to be created.
Right.
Okay? And now it's somewhat counterintuitive. Like how do you bring high tech into construction? So for instance, the entrepreneur who went and founded this company, his realization was he comes from the chip design industry.
Right.
So his realization was if I take a chip and I simply magnify it, it looks like a building. It behaves like a building.
Okay.
So can I take simulation techniques, optimization techniques, design techniques from chip design industry and apply it to building design?
Right.
So as you can see, it's a very innovative, somewhat off the beaten path idea
Right.
that's looking to actually take one of the oldest industries known to us and do cause some basic disruption in that area.
Okay. Right.
Something about myself. My name is Ajit Singh. You already know that.
Yeah.
I've been a partner at Ardaman for over 5 years now, and before that, I ran a portfolio company of Ardaman. I was the CEO of a company called Bioimagen, which was acquired by Roche in 2010. And before that, it was a long, 20-year-long career with Siemens.
Okay.
So I started out in R&D, spent many years there, then went and ran a global business unit in oncology, then ran a global business in the area of digital imaging, and I left literally after 20 years to come do a startup.
What's your focus?
At Ardaman, my focus is all life science and healthcare.
Okay.
So Ardaman is a domain agnostic firm. So our investments are in, as I mentioned, construction, they are in healthcare, they are in tech, they are in agriculture, they are in magnetism or magnetics. So it's a very domain agnostic portfolio, but my focus is predominantly life science and healthcare.
Life science, healthcare. How many investments you have made so far?
So Ardaman total has probably 30 plus investments currently that we're looking after. And I have made 7 investments
Okay.
Since I started in the last 5 years.
Uh-huh.
And as I mentioned, they happen to be, so within healthcare, they happen to be in the area of clinical diagnostics.
Mhm.
There are several reasons why I believe clinical diagnostics is very important. It's only 3% of the total healthcare expense. So diagnostics is only 3% of the total healthcare expense, but it controls 75% of the expense downstream. 3% upfront, 75% downstream. So you have a 25 times leverage,
Right.
which is unheard of in any industry.
Right.
So hence, we're quite focused on diagnostics, but we also have companies in the services space, therapy selection, medical concierge services. So it has some diversity in the portfolio.
Okay. So how you identify a good startup or a promising startup
Right.
which has a bright future?
Why would I tell you the answer? No, in all seriousness, that's not easy, obviously.
Right.
I'm stating the obvious. So we tend to focus very much on the entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a reason for that. In general, the quality of the entrepreneur matters. Whether you're running a
Right.
small company, early stage, late stage, technology, non-technology, small company, large company, quality of leadership always matters.
Right.
For an early stage company, it matters even more. Because at an early stage company, what do you have? You have an idea and you have a plan. There's nothing else. So what do? You focus on the entrepreneur, right? So if the entrepreneur is good, by good I mean should have good leadership instincts,
Right.
should have good intuition, should have the ability to know their failures. If you're going to fail fast and move on. What's the point of spending a good part of your life trying to solve an unimportant problem?
Mm-hmm.
So in entrepreneurship, you'll often fail fast and move on.
Right.
So to have that ability is a critical trait we look for. And obviously you cannot predict how a person will behave in the future, but you can look at how they behaved in the past. And do they have the ability to reinvent themselves, modify themselves, fail and move? If they have those traits, then we go forward. So that's first criteria. Second is it should be a good idea, right? A good, strong idea. It should fit our thesis. Large markets, technology, science, multidisciplinary, it should fit those theses. But even then, there's no guarantee because you might have a great entrepreneur, might have a great idea, but somewhere along the way, you have to change direction, right? Because if it's early stage, there's bound to be some misplanning, bound to be some incorrect understanding as you start.
Right.
So that's why the entrepreneur matters. If the entrepreneur has the ability to make that switch, then it's good.
Okay.
However, he should not make that switch too often, right?
Right.
So it's a balance.
Right. So what do you think about the venture capital industry now compared with the past?
Interesting question. I will draw it in three phases. There was a phase very early on in the 60s and 70s, maybe even early 80s.
Okay.
Then there's a phase which has gone from, let's say, mid 90s for about 10 years, and there's a phase now. So if I go very early stage venture, they had the right idea in my opinion. They were truly what I call venture. They fit the definition. You take some risks, you look for difficult problems to solve, and go solve them. And if you fail, solve a different problem.
Right.
Somewhere in the 10-15 year period, starting in the mid to late 90s until mid 2000, I believe there's a shift towards much more shorter term, quick flip type of investments. So if you look at all of the social media investments, I'm not saying social media is unimportant. It has a role. But how much role does it have in life? I mean, does it have so much role that it should trump agriculture, technology, healthcare, infrastructure? Is it so much more important? So if you put together, juxtapose social media, non-social media.
Yeah.
Okay. Social media addresses basically the business model is advertisement. Yeah, that's roughly a $500 billion business globally. If you look at everything else, agriculture, all the other areas, in the US alone, that's $16 trillion. $16 trillion. Ad industry employs 5 million people. Non-ad, so infrastructure, healthcare, etc., employs 95 million people. Okay, 5 million, 95 million. $500 billion, $500 billion, $16 trillion.
Okay.
Yet, there's so much investment in the social media direction,
Right.
and not enough in infrastructure, healthcare, energy, etc.
Right.
So I believe there's a trend in the last 5 years to go back to the basics and say, what societal problems do we need to solve? What are the large problems? So obviously, it should have, for a venture capitalist, it should have the opportunity of a return of investment. It should have potential of good return, but it should also solve some large problems of the society.
Right.
So I think there's a trend going back to basics, and we feel good that we've been sort of in the forefront of that trend already 10 years ago.
Right. Right. Okay. Let's go back a little bit. So why after you get exit for the entrepreneur career, so why you consider to be a venture capital?
Me personally?
Yes.
Oh wow, that's a good question. So let me start first by telling you what my job is, what
Okay.
I do right now,
Okay.
and why that was for me a natural move.
Okay.
So being an early stage technology investment firm or being an early stage investment firm focused on multidisciplinary technology approach, you end up having to do a lot of hands-on work. Right? You get involved with the entrepreneur at a very detailed, practical, day-to-day level, whether it is strategy, whether it is technology, whether it's go-to-market. So which means to some degree I still behave like an entrepreneur.
All right.
Right? Obviously, there's a CEO, there's a founder, they have their job, and you should
Right.
not get in their way.
Right.
Yet, the nature of involvement is such that it's very closely linked with the entrepreneur. A lot of hands-on work, which means the nature of work has obviously changed somewhat, that I'm an investor now, but at some grassroots level, I still do what I used to do when I was a CEO.
Okay.
Okay. So for me personally, it was a very natural move. Having spent 20 years in a large company, 3 years in a very young startup, having seen sort of both sides of that spectrum, the natural next thing for me to want to try was investment. So now I look back, I think it was a great decision.
Okay. Just nature transfer.
It just turned out very organically, very naturally. It went
Okay.
there.
Okay. So you focused on life science and healthcare. What do you see for the next 3 to 5 years in that industry?
In the healthcare life sciences
Yeah,
industry,
in healthcare life
there's a
sciences.
number of broad trends that are quite important. So number one, there is a trend towards precision medicine, okay, which means how do you direct the therapy to the specific traits of the patient. Right? So that's one very broad and very important trend. Second is there'll be a increased focus on wellness and prevention. By the way, that's not a new idea. Wellness and prevention has been known for thousands of years. And even in the venture industry, it's been known for at least 30, 40 years. But there'll be an increased focus because the way healthcare cost is going, it's not sustainable. So something very fundamental will have to be done to solve that problem. Hence, wellness prevention will be an important area. Third important trend would be consumerization of healthcare. Right? So consumer will have to take a more active role. Otherwise, we cannot solve the massive cost problem that faces us. Probably one more trend that's relevant is that self-pay markets will have an increased relevance in the healthcare story.
Okay.
So self-pay markets like India, China, some parts of Brazil, most parts of Africa. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they were not so relevant.
Right.
US was relevant, Western Europe was relevant. That game is changing. So the self-pay markets will play a very important role in the future of healthcare. So those are the broad trends I see that would, and of course I've already spoken about diagnostics
Right.
and why I think it's important.
Right. So, as the one of the biggest developing country, China, as well as India, of course. So they do have huge demand for innovation and for the next generation technology. So what do you see as a venture capital based on Silicon Valley, as a point of view from Silicon Valley? How Silicon Valley could cooperate with the developing country to at the venture capital side, either on the innovation side?
Right. So I'll first give you a qualification of the question first, and I'll try to answer the question.
Okay.
We no longer think of China and India as developing countries. No
Okay.
longer. We think of them as fairly developed countries now.
Okay.
Why do I say that? If I look at China, so 1.x billion population, 10% of them is fairly wealthy.
Right.
They can afford pretty much most things. 20-30% of them is good middle class. Okay, that's 300 million people. That's bigger than the population of the United States, almost as big as the US.
Right.
Same thing is true for India. So while it is true that the society still is somewhat haves and have-nots,
Right.
there are many people who are very poor, who need help, and for whom innovation in healthcare needs to follow a certain path.
Right.
But there is a fairly large number of people whose needs are those of a developed country, whose ability to pay is that of a developed country. Okay?
Right.
So strictly as an investor, I do not think of India and China as developing countries because
Okay.
there's a very large portion of the market there that can act, behave, pay exactly like a developed country.
Okay.
There are some bad things about that as well because it is also creating diseases of lifestyle like diabetes, metabolic disorders, cancer, etc. that obviously will consume a large part of the healthcare cost.
Right.
But that said, we are taking India and China very seriously. So if I look at China specifically, we have one of our companies actually is China based.
Okay.
And it's a company in the area of cancer diagnostics, specifically liquid biopsy.
Mhm.
And we have a large customer base and growing customer base in China. Similarly, if I look at India, there are 2 companies that have their sort of innovation headquarters in India,
Right.
and there are 4 companies that have both innovation aspect of the business as well as the market in India. So we're taking India and China fairly, they are a significant part of our thinking.
Right.
Yeah. But even if I speak now from just not from an Ardaman perspective, but how venture should look at countries like India and China, they'll be increasingly important.
Right.
So I'll give you one small statistic. When I started at Siemens, that was 1988, the global healthcare expense in any area was approximately 2 times the United States. So you take the US number, multiply by 2, you get the global number.
Okay.
Okay. So for example, in those days, there were 500 MRI units sold in the US. Multiply that by 2, there were 1,000 worldwide. Go forward 10 years, so 1998, 1999, the number moved from 2x to 2.5x, which means US was about 40% of the global market. So take the US number, multiply by 2.5, you have the global number. What is it today? So it was 2x in 98, 2.5x in 1998, and now let's say 2017, 20 years later, what is that number?
5.
6x, so close enough. So US is now only 17, 18% of the global healthcare expense.
Okay.
So obviously US has not gotten smaller.
Right.
The rest of the world has become bigger.
Right. What else we have? Anything you want to add? I think we have covered most of the question.
No, it's been a great discussion. I think you have the right idea
Yes.
as a Chinese-based entity to be right in the heart of Silicon Valley, to observe, to benchmark, to create your own activity here.
Okay,
And
for so I have a question for overseas startup, for overseas entrepreneur. They come to Silicon Valley and they start their own business here. So what should they do to get into the right market?
Right.
Over there?
so, first of all, being physically here helps.
Right.
Okay. You sit in the Starbucks coffee shop on University Avenue, and you just watch the traffic of people and see what kind of people come there.
Right.
You sit down and randomly start talking to anyone, and something happens. And usually that something is good. It's a conversation. And that conversation is very often a dialogue, and the dialogue leads to something and some network, and it progresses from there. So being physically here helps. My sort of the best sort of, or maybe the most relevant guidance I can give is don't be in any rush.
Okay.
Right? So good ideas or big ideas take easily a decade to build. Right? There's no shortcut. It takes a great idea that's looking to disrupt a large market is going to take easily a decade. So if you start 3 months later, nothing is going to change.
Okay.
Right? So take the time, understand, make the ecosystem, meet the ecosystem people, and develop your thinking to a level of detail which has some degree of robustness before you actually jump.
Right.
That's the first advice I can give. The rest is do not forget the market that you came from. Those are very relevant markets going forward. And so more specifically, when you create a medical product, for example,
Mhm.
the historical belief used to be we need to succeed in the US first.
Right.
Okay? So 510K, all of that stuff, it's just still important. But you don't have to succeed in the US first. You can succeed in China first and then do it in the US. You can succeed in India first, then do it in the US. Why? Those are quite relevant markets as well now.
Right.
So I'm not suggesting that you have to bypass the regulatory system.
Mhm.
That's not. I'm suggesting it's no longer essential to succeed in the US first.
Right.
You could go succeed elsewhere
Okay.
and then come to the US.
Right.
Right. So that's a significant shift from 10 years ago.
Right. Anything you want to add?
No, I think that's enough.
Did I do a good job?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay.
So for the just chatting. So for we are now doing a newsletter sending to hundreds of thousands of Chinese entrepreneurs with successful Chinese entrepreneurs. They have their enterprise in China, which been doing successful. So if you have some portfolio or